How's it going, everyone? Welcome, Eulier Gonzalez here. And today, finally, let's going to look at now the CSS. This is a course taught by Josh Komewa, a software engineer that has previously worked at Khan Academy and also Gatsby. So he actually developed this particular course, or these two courses. One is the CSS for developers, which is what we're gonna do in today's video, and the other is the joy of React. In other words, is that how do you now understand React deeply, and therefore you can describe and provide now solutions and also fix some of those problems that might arise when you look at particular code base, right? So far so good, because that's what we want to do in other videos, other series of videos. But in today's video, CSS for JavaScript developers, this is now a model that has 10 models. Yes, this is broken up into 10 models. So first we'll look at the recap of the CSS, all right, which is talking about is what is CSS, what is the introduction to CSS from MDM docs, where we look at how you can add style sheets, external style sheets, internal and inline style, as well as the selectors such as class, tags, also combinators, and the state-based selectors, which is the pseudo class and pseudo elements. And now this is interesting. I want to make a quick pause here, because those states now are handled by the browser, right? So in other words, anytime that you do a hover, okay, it is internally now the browser that keep track of each individual state, and therefore when they are enabled, you just only apply that particular rule. Also, we look at the additional features of the anatomy of CSS, which is the functions. All right, there are several functions we can go, such as the math, as well as translate, cramp, which is a new one, translate, cramp, HSL for colors, the add rules as well, which is indicating how CSS should behave, such as media query, keyframes, and I just want to take a look at that. All right, so want to take a look at that. Especially adding CSS using common selectors, other CSS syntax. So for example, call is not math, is call, transform, background color, rules, add rules, which provide instructions for how CSS should behave. Exactly, it provides instructions for how CSS should behave. One common rule that are likely you encounter is media. It's gonna provide certain instructions of how CSS is gonna behave. So when you reach to that particular viewport, whether it's min or max, I want you to apply this set of rule. But again, this set of instructions that you are that you tell how CSS should behave. All right, and then we look at the CSS command as well as the shorthand for that, right? There is another one as well, the shorthand property. Okay, for example, font, background, padding, border, and margin are called shorthand because the property can be, well, as I mentioned before, shorthand, right? Now, why this is important? Because to make a quick recap of all of the things that we have from the MDN docs, at least to know general basics of what it's doing, and now get a more practical sense in terms of what are the tools that, despite that there are several JavaScript libraries that generate all of this CSS uh, or any other modern tooling that generate is the CSS for us, there's still now some of them uh, tools that are important for us to know, right? So these nifty details that we need to know. So for example, is one of them is starting from what is a rule, all right? So what is a rule? What is a declaration? Again, we're talking about in the context of CSS. So what is a rule? What is a declaration? What is a value? What is a unit? All right. And then look at, well, as I mentioned before, the most common cases for that. So for example, we have now stuff like the media queries, all right, which is still relevant. So we know why is that. I actually have experience on that. So the media query, the selectors, all right, such as pseudo selectors and pseudo elements, and why this is still relevant despite that you have all of this modern tooling. So pseudo classes such as hover and focus, and why it's important to look at focus, because this is something that is used by the WCAG, which is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. It follows 4 principles, that is perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. It stands for poor. That's not a great acronym, but in any case, in any case, poor. But knowing that those principles and what is the website that we can take a look to do that, well, a lot of the time it's gonna save us much time if we need to provide is that accessibility to our applications, right? And well, know when we need to look when it comes to provide accessibility to our web apps. So in any case, I also look at the check for radio or radio and check boxes and radio buttons, okay, and the first and last child, the first end type and the last end type, all right, which are still relevant to know, all right. And then we also look at what is the difference between first and last child versus first of type and last of type. And they say that if you want to select now the first or the last element of using that selector, okay. Again, this is an internal state that CSS is going to behave. You're going to maintain that, all right. And when it found that first or last type of selectors that you pass, then it's going to apply those rules. So the other is the pseudo elements, such as the placeholder, which is useful to indicate how will be the format of this input, useful for forms, and the after and before, where it say, well, now we want this is useful for decoration, okay. I also look at the combinators, and most common combinators for that, like this, the send selectors, and another is the child selector, all right. Which is, again, this is the most common, the fundamental of that. We also look at the color, which is part of the anatomy of the fundamentals of CSS, all right? So far we have described is the anatomy of a rule, the selectors, the combinators, the color, where we can use it for types. We have 4 formats, whether it is the keyword for educational, the Xcode, the RGB, which is great for readability, but if you want to nuance color, we use now the HSL, for example, like this, all right? And how this is using now a hue, or in other words, is a ring of color as a third property that go from 0 to 3060 degree. You can show all of this color, the palette of color there. And the other is the saturation, which show us the how gray out or vibrant is this color. And the other is the luminosity, which 50% indicate that this is the true color of this. Why HSL is way much more interesting to go with rather than the other, because here you can now select is the nuance colors, right? We as designers and developers, we have now a mental model of how this color will go, and go from red to yellow, green, blue, and go back to red, right? And as you can see, is pretty much the same of the primary color here, right? You have now red and yellow, and then green, greenish, purple, and then the blue and bluish, and then reddish, bluish, right? Until it reaches to the purple. But the great news of this is that if you are able, for some reasons, to remember this, all right, well, we can now have those nuance color way much more faster. So we know that here the red is 0%, 120 is, well, actually this is 300 exactly. 120 is the green color, all right, and the other is a 217 is the blue color. And if you don't believe me, let's check this out here. Let's check this out. Let's completely check this out. Exactly. What about you? Can I add a color here? If I say Alice Blue, is gonna exactly. That's right, which is good. Let's go to use now HSL, but I would prefer to use this as a background color. Right? So background color. You say, hey, this is to actually see that. All right. And here we say, hey, I want to use the HSL. We're now 120 degrees. And the saturation of this will be is 0, all right? I want to be is the true color of this, or a vibrant color. I think it is. I want to have a vibrant color, and the I want to have a vibrant color. All right, and then I want to get that. So as you can see here, that's interesting. What, this doesn't take that? Invalid property value. Oh, really? Oh, of course. It's because it's this. Exactly, must be as a degree. Exactly, so 120 degree is green. So you know, you can now intuitively get this color. A blue will be now something like 240. All right, blue is 240, and of course 3060 is now red, right? So here we can actually way much more better to predict what is the color that we want us to pick, and especially we want us to have now some nuance color. All right, let's say, hey, I want to have now is more gray out color, right? A more gray out color is a saturation. Let's say the saturation is now 0%, so I can get that now saturation, right? Let's say like 10%, right? I want to have now a color that is somewhat red, but is with this gray out color, all right? And I want to be this as a true color, because if I say, for example, 100, this is white or black, all right? So now we can here is get a more precise intuition about the colors. This is the reason why actually we are doing this, okay, with HSL. There is also another which is HSL-A to apply now a filter, all right? But if you want to apply now a particular filter, let's say an opacity, for that we can say is grouping that and removing all of that, and then pass the particular opacity we can pass to that, right? And this is great because now we develop an intuition of how this actually works, despite that we don't need to know what is this, but as long as it belongs to this value, we can know, even though that there are now some text ID that tells you is the color of this, but you can now know what is the a color by looking is at this value. You can develop this intuition, and that's the whole point of this, my friend. That's the whole point of this. That's the whole point of this. That's the whole point of this. Exactly. That's the whole point of this. Absolutely. That's the whole point of this. Now, so because of that, all right. Actually, we take the deal here. We do the themes with the HSL color, with the color basic. Also, we look at the unit. So what is n? What is root n? What is the percentage? So for example, n is take now the font size value for the current element and apply that to that. The other is a root element, or the ren, which takes now is the HTML font size as a reference, and how we use that percentage rather than the pixels. And the percentage, which is another nuance here, especially when you want to develop some sort of or you want to calculate is the height, all right? The height algorithm, which is something that we're gonna see that later, all right? Particularly in this interesting, holy moly, particularly in this model, all right? The height algorithm, and how do we calculate that, all right? And the other is the aspect ratio, which of course this is more and a more in-depth course about how we're going to build all of this kind of stuff, so on and so forth, yada yada yada, which is great. So yeah. So yeah, all right. We also look at the typography. What is this typography? What is important to know the typography? The typography font families, all right? So with the typography, we look at the basic stuff that we need to know. First is the font family, the web fonts, as well as the text or typical text formatting, where you have now bold, italic, and underlined text, which is something that you don't see that in other contexts, in other, for example, text formatting, all right, or the underlined text, as well as the styles text, another style tags, but underline is another format. The alignment, the spacing, and the transformation. So the idea of the font family, since this is a multi-character char set, so for example in the case of Roboto, it contains now 6 font width and 2 formats or 2 variants, all right, which is the bold and the regular. So because now this is provided by default by the OS, so for example Arial, Tahoma, Times New Roman, and application that wants to provide now a better experience, they create their own custom fonts, and that is when the web fonts get in here, which is a way to give now is this font is a way how they impregnate with this experience to the user. Impregnate sounds hard, sounds powerful, so we say is we want to now provide this unique experience, and through web font is the way to do this. So this web font, which is how you now branding, or this is the branding, part of the branding here, the web font. We can go with Google Fonts or with other, we can go with Google Fonts, that's one, or any other CDN that actually hosts our fonts, okay? And we explore also is the type of formats, where you have what I mentioned before is the bold for important stuff, italic for this in-person conversation, or when you have a conversation an in-person conversations, there's a lot of clue that is around, or there is a lot of clue that are known. There is a lot of clues that are not there is a lot of clues that are not Jesus there is a lot of clues that are not non-verbal. Is that there is a non give me a second. Right, way much better. All right. That's right. So there's a lot of non-conversational clues. There's a lot of non-verbal clue that happens in an in-person conversation. So the italic wants to describe what's happened there. So for example, is when a character when you're reading the text and a character now is thinking, you use italic. Or for example, you want to express that this is a TV show, a book, or a series, you use italic. Or if it's describing some scientific or foreign languages, expressions, you use now italic. If you want to quote now from some other places, all right, or if the character in that particular book is actually quoting from other places, you use now italic, and that's quite interesting. And this is starting to give you now is how you can write a particular book, and so on and so forth. Okay, now why this is important? Because once we know this, and the other is the underline, which is indicate that this is not a hyperlink. Some another semantics tags, for example, like end and strong, but this is for letting those assistant technologies now emphasize on that language or on that phrases. Okay. Any non-pointer device, all right, which is no mouse, no keyboard, so no mouse or no a touch, okay. And well, describing is the font or text transformation, text alignment, and text spacing. Okay, so this is important, all right, because this is the fundamental things that we need to look or that we need to learn according to Josh Comer, all right. That first thing first is the CSS, all right. So what is the CSS? The introduction of CSS. Look at what is the anatomy of a CSS rule. What is a rule? Then some common and useful things that we need to use, and that's to be quite interesting, all right? That is still relevant for us, despite that we have all of this machinery going on. So we, for example, the media queries, the selectors, of course. So the selectors, the pseudo classes, pseudo elements, and the different nuance in there, as well as the WACAG, all right, exactly, the WCAG, this web standard for accessibility, as well as the combinators, the combinators, the units, the color, the color, and the type and the typography. All right. So a couple of things here that's going on here. There's a couple of things that's here. Okay. So you have now the anatomy of a rule. All right. The anatomy of a rule. And I want to number up to keep in mind of that. So the anatomy of a rule, the selectors, okay, pseudo classes, pseudo elements, the combinators, all right. So how you can actually select your elements in the DOM via CSS, how you combine them, for example, like child selector or direct ancestor. There's also another selectors like next to sibling, okay, and the color, okay, the color, the unit, and the text uh, formatting, okay, or the typography here. All right, some debugging techniques that are quite helpful. All right, that you can shift between color format. For example, here, if we go to this, all right, if we go to this and say, hey, I can shift between color format. Why doesn't shift? Okay, this is part of the shorthand color. Does it have this implemented? Let me let it focus. And all right, it seems that this version, it seems that this browser doesn't have that. Okay, okay. So browsers like Chrome actually had that, but it seems that this fork of Chromium doesn't allow to change that. Doesn't have that implemented. All right, no problema, no problema, no problema, no problem. Now, finally, to what we want, to what we really care, which is the rendering logic. Here we are. So model 1, rendering logic. completely. Rendering logic. Rendering logic here. Rendering logic model 1. All right. Here we are. So fundamentally, the goal of CSS is to allow you control the appearance and layout of your app's content. So let's going to write this. Fundamentally. Okay, fundamentally. So fundamentally, the goal. So fundamentally, the goal of CSS, okay, is to allow you control. Fundamentally, the goal of CSS is to allow you control over the layout and appearance. Over the layout and appearance. Appearance of your app content, of your apps content. That's the whole point of this. I can have control over how it's gonna look like and how it's gonna display this. Alright? You don't quite start with a blank canvas. HTML tags do include a few minimal styles. So for example, here are the built-in style for a tags in Chrome 86. Okay? So you have now this color, web link, cursor, and text decoration. These styles are part of the user agent style sheet. So yes, so you don't quite, okay, so you don't quite start with blank canvas. You don't quite start with blank canvas. So HTML tags do include a few minimal HTML, a few minimal CSS, a few minimal styles. HTML tags do include a few minimal styles. Alright, so for example, here are the built-in style for A tags. Okay, so for example, here are the minimal, yeah, here are the minimal, here are the built-in style for A tags. Okay, here are the built-in tags for anchor tag in Chrome 86. Okay, so you got things like this. So you have now the color, the cursor, and the text decoration is underlined. These styles are part of a user agent style sheet. So these styles are part of the user agent style sheet. Okay? The user agent style sheet. Each browser includes their own style sheets, full of base styles like this. So each browser, this is one of the reasons why we have this reset for that. Each browser has their own style sheet of base styles like this. So each browser has their own style sheet base. Each browser has their own style sheet full of base styles like this. Full of base styles like this. Alright. There are some hard rules in the HTML specification, and there are some besides that, there are some hard rules in HTML specifications, but for most part, each browser come up with its own default style. That's why Focus Ring looks so different across browsers. Okay, not only that, each browser has their own or user agent style sheets. Okay, alright, but also there are some hard rules in HTML specification for the most part. Each browser comes with its own default styles. So there are some hard rules. There are some hard rules in the HTML specification. All right, but for the most part, each browser come out with its own default. So each browser comes up with its own default style. So that's why focus rings look so different across browser. That's why focus rings so different across different browsers. Okay. So in the past, it was common to use a CSS Reset for this. So in the past, it was common to use CSS Reset for this. That's mind-blowing, bro. To strip away many of these default user agent style. This day, though, browsers are a bit more consistent in how they render elements, and there are a growing awareness that we shouldn't expect our site applications to be identical across browsers and devices. My personal global style template, but it's because of this. It's because browsers now it's because now browsers okay, since CSS allows you to control over the appearance and the styles, the appearance and the layout of your app's content, and since you don't start with an empty canvas, for example, now each browser has their own specific has their own specific style sheet. Okay. It was common in the past. It was common to use this. Okay. In the past, it was common to use a CSS Reset for that, to strip away many of this default user agent style. To strip away many of this many of this default user agent style, many of these agent user styles, agent styles. Okay, many of these user agent styles. So these days, though, browsers are a bit more consistent in how they render elements, and there's a growing awareness that we shouldn't expect our webs or sites applications to be identical across browsers and devices. Exactly. So this day, despite that browsers are much more consistent in how they render elements, okay, there is a growing awareness that we shouldn't expect. There is a growing awareness. Okay, there is a growing awareness that we shouldn't expect, that we shouldn't expect to our website or application to be identical. That's interesting. To be identical. Okay. To be identical across browser and devices. Even though my personal global styles templates, however, I start a new project and I rely on the set of baselines functional CSS rule. I share this global style over my blog, a modern CSS. Mhm. For a long time, I used Erick Meyer function famous CSS Reset. It is a solid chunk of CSS, but it's a bit long in the tooth at this point, and I haven't been updated in more than a decade, and a lot has changed since then. Recently, I have been using my own custom CSS Reset. It includes all the little tricks I have discovered to improve both the user experience and the CSS authoring experience. Like other CSS Reset, it is unopinionated when it comes to design and cosmetic, and you can use these resets to any projects, no matter the aesthetic you are going for. In this tutorial, we go on a tour of my custom CSS and we'll dig into each rule, and you will learn what it does and why you might want to use it. Applying this reset to existing code bases. As a general rule, I don't recommend trying to apply any CSS to a existing code base. Whenever we think with baseline styles, we risk themes breaking in subtle ways that we might not notice, but users will. If you do go this route, be sure to do extensive testing to make sure everything still looks good. Interesting. The CSS reset. Without further ado, here it is. So we have now a user more intuitive boxing model. Alright. The CSS reset. Without further ado, use a more intuitive box sizing model. Okay, whether it's for all elements and the pseudo elements for that, before and after, all of them must be the box sizing. Remove default margins. Enable keyword animations. Enable keyword animations. Prefers reduce motions, no preference. HTML interpolate sites allow keywords. Body, add accessible line height. Alright, minimum, improve text rendering. Improve text rendering. WebKit font smoothing, anti-aliasing. Improve media defaults. Okay. Image, picture, videos, and canvas display all of them as a block. And math wicks 100%. Inherit font for form controls. Input button text area select font inherit. Avoid text overflow. Okay. Inherit fonts for form control. Avoid text overflows like this. Improve line wrapping. Text wrap pretty. H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, H6. Text wrap balance. Okay, improve line wrapping. And create a root stacking context. Root and next. Okay, create a root stacking context. That's interesting. Exactly. Isolate. It is a relatively short, but there is a lot of stuff packed into this small style sheet, and let's get into it. A pedantic note. Historically, the main goal of CSS has been to ensure consistency between browsers and to undo all default styles, creating a blank slate. My CSS Reset doesn't really do either of these things. This day, browser has massive discrepancy when it comes to layout or spacing. By large, browsers implementing the CSS specification faithfully. That's not a good word. Okay, faithfully. Okay. Browsers implements the CSS specifications faithfully, and things behave as you had expect. So it is in so it is so it isn't is so it isn't necessary anymore. I also don't believe it is necessary to strip away all of the browser's default. I probably do want M tags to set font style italic, for example. I can always make different design decisions in the individual project style, but I see no point in stripping away common sense default. My CSS resets may not fit the classical decision of a CSS reset, but I'm taking that creativity liberty. Mm-hmm. But again, it's because it's the CSS tool reset CSS. Mm-hmm. Exactly. Take all of this and set the margin padding button. Exactly. Most of them now aligns. Okay. And the other is the HTML5 display roles set reset for older browsers. Okay. Because most of them focus. Okay. Because most of them focus is on how they're gonna look like. All right. So you tag all of the HTML elements. You put now a margin and a padding and a font size and font inherit. Interesting. Identity archipelago. Video. Okay. Masonry, item flow, and gold. Mm-hmm. CSS naked day. Nested selector, color shading and blending, thanks to color mix, and more and better has use. Note that by came true, I mean reach at least baseline new available, not reach baseline universal. Hanging punctuation, margin and line box trimming, stroke at text, expanded attributes. Mm-hmm. Yes, I still want CSX exclusion, give track and gaps, displays a grip and column track. Yes, I still want a grid equivalent of column rule, except more. Okay, this is like the suggestions, and we're still using media queries. You see. Designed for real life, online for free and on sale for money. Announcing BCD Watch. Designed for real life. A decade later, a decade plus. Mm-hmm. That's interesting here. It's powered by WordPress. Most of the rest of the site is a hand authored. Erick and Catherine Meyer. All reserved right. All right reserved. Erick Meyer. Catherine S. Meyer. Mhm. That's interesting. On behalf of web standard, most notably CSS, a technique for managing how HTML is displayed and how not only how it's displayed, how it is appearance and layout. Meyer has written a number of books and articles of CSS and given many presentations promoting its use. Erick currently works for A.K.A, software consulting company. It's a private worker-owned, employee-run, cooperative model consultancy focused on open source, based in Coruna, Galicia. A.K.A is known for its contributions and commitment to both open source and open standards. A.K.A's primary focus is on open source solutions for a large set of hardware and software platforms, centering on browsers, graphic multimedia, compilers, virtualizations, embedded Linux, and device drivers. Interesting. Egalia.com. Okay. It's a free consultancy with headquarters in Spain and an extended network of collaborators around the world. We're passionate about our work, active in our community, eager to learn, yada yada. Mm-hmm. Egalia. Mm-hmm. Exactly. Web development, browsers, compiler, and networking. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's quite interesting here. That's quite interesting here. That's quite interesting here. That's quite interesting. Mhm. Mhm. That's interesting.
The features of the localization, and with the most important thing about patterns is that at the end of the day, every single method.
Mhm. Okay, that's interesting. Mhm. That's very, very interesting. Mhm. Okay. Mhm. Mhm. Interesting. Okay. Holy moly. This is a new word that opened up. Okay. That's interesting. That's very, very interesting. All right. That's a very, very interesting stuff. Now, holy moly. Exactly. All of this opened up a new world to me that I was barely aware of it. Okay? I was barely aware of it. Barely aware of it. Barely. Barely. barely, bro, barely. Barely, barely. Okay. So, because now the browsers, because fundamentally now CSS allows to control the appearance and the layout of how our web app content is gonna be shown. Okay. Now, since this is not a quite blank canvas, it has its own user agent styles sheets. All right, each browser has their own. So this is one of the reasons why, for example, Focus actually looks quite different across browsers. So in the past, it was common to use something called a CSS Reset to strip away many of this user agent style. However, despite that this day now browsers are more consistently, okay, in rendering elements, is a growing awareness that you shouldn't expect that your browsers or that your website or applications to look like identical across browsers and devices. So, because of this, all right, there are now for a long time, for a long time, a CSS reset was used by a CSS reset was used from Erick Meyer, you know, from Erick Meyer, famous CSS. And for a long time, a CSS reset was used from Erick Meyer. All right, from Erick Meyer. Let me actually point that out. Exactly, it doesn't give us is 2008, and now this is 2011. From 2011. However, a decade has passed. It has been a decade and a lot of has changed. Exactly. It has been a decade and a lot of have changed. And a lot of has changed. You know? And a lot of has changed since then. So now Josh Gomewa create is a baseline functional CSS and last update this. So Josh Gomewa has now created a more exactly, because the idea of this to applying this CSS is for that. Okay, so Josh Gomewa has now created a modern of 2025 CSS Reset that still focus on that, right? So Josh Gomewa has now created a modern 2025 CSS Reset that focus on inconsistency. All right, Browser inconsistency. When it comes to design as cosmetic, you can use this reset to any project, no matter the aesthetic here. When it comes to design and cosmetic, okay, on design, when it comes to design and cosmetic, exactly. So Josh Como has now created a model CSS reset on opinionated, yeah, unopinionated that. So unopinionated when it comes to design and layout. Alright, which is this. Warning. I think this is so warning. As a general rule, I don't recommend trying to apply any CSS resets to an existing code base. As a general rule, I don't recommend to apply any CSS reset to an existing code base. The changes might be subtle to be detected by developers, but your users will notice. You know? If you go for it, make extensive testing. And that's something that is expensive, bro. Do an extensive testing is expensive. All right. Oh, there you fuck. And we're back. All right. All right. So now that we look at that, and the reason, so now that we understand this, and the reason why we have the CSS is because all of this, so fundamentally, the idea of CSS is that we have now control over the layout and the appearance of the web content. So, because of that, we don't live in an empty canvas, because now, for example, browsers like Chrome actually have their own built-in style sheet known as user agent style sheet. So because all of these different browsers come up with this as a way to strip away all of this and have now a common base where we can trust. So we have now this CSS Reset, which was created for Erick Meyer, which is a software consultant at a company at 2007. Holy moly! Before the housing, before the housing crash, all right. Before the housing crash, and that was made in 2011. So a decade has passed, and a lot of has changed since then. So, Josh Komua, the instructor of this particular course, create this particular CSS, which is non-opinionated when it comes to design and layouts, to now tackle those more appropriate and relevant style when you want to create a website from scratch, because these CSS are not recommended to use in existing code bases, because perhaps your developer, if they apply that, they cannot see the subtle change that it introduces, but their users will. And if you go to that route, it involves a lot of and extensive testing. So it is up to you to decide if you want to go with that route, right? So, a pedantic note. Historically, the main goal of CSS Reset has been to ensure consistency between browsers and to undo all default style, creating a blank state or a blank slate. So my CSS Reset doesn't really do either of these things. Alright, so to undo all of the default style. These days browsers don't have massive discrepancy when it comes to layout or spacing, especially this. Alright, by large, browsers implement the CSS specification faithfully, and things behave as you expect, so it isn't necessary anymore. I also don't believe it is necessary to strip away all the browser's default. I probably do want M tag to set font style italic, for example. I can always make different design decisions and individual project style, but I see no point in stripping away common sense default. So my CSS may not fit for the classical definition of a CSS reset, but I'm taking that creativity liberty, right? Because most those CSS focus is on ensuring consistency between browsers, to undo all default style and creating a blank slate. So exactly, this is what now the main goal of CSS Reset was about. Okay. So historically, the main goal of CSS Reset has been to ensure consistency between browsers and to undo all default styles, creating a blank state. Because now those browsers different. So the Joshua Common CSS, the Josh Common CSS Reset doesn't do a lot of this thing. Doesn't do a lot of this thing. Okay. Because now, and it is based on the exactly, and it is based that browsers discrepancies are less exactly. So now so it is based that browser has no that why browser don't have massive discrepancies. So browsers is based that browsers don't have massive discrepancies. Alright? Browsers don't have massive discrepancies as it is when it comes to layout or spacing. When it comes to layout or spacing. Exactly. Not in that regard. Layout or spacing. No, not massive, but still they do. Not massive, but they still do. So, with that, all right, we look at the rendering logic. So first we look at the inheritance. The inheritance, enforcing inheritance. Okay. Built-in declarations and inheritance. Okay, the rendering model. Built-in declarations. Exactly. Built-in declarations and inheritance. And inheritance. Built-in declarations and inheritance. And a warning. Okay. And a warning. Now we're gonna talk about is the inheritance. Inheritance. Exactly. Inheritance. Let's say we have a pink paragraph with some emphasis. Okay. Notice that M tag wrapping around the word you. How come the word you is color pink? If you think about it, we haven't applied any style to it. I know you, but what am I? The answer is that certain CSS property inherit when I apply a color to an element. The value get passed down to all children and grandchildren. Not all CSS properties are inheritable, though. Let's look at another example. So for example, like this. It is a similar situation, but instead of applying a pink color, we apply a pink border. Notice that border value doesn't get passed down to n. We still only have one border, and it is around the entire of this. If we explicitly add the same border value to both paragraphs and emphasis tag, we see a second border within our paragraph, which is drawn like this. And it's interesting. Oh, because we add some pixel there. No? What about now? Okay. If you have worked with CSS for a while, this behavior probably isn't surprising to you, but it's a bit weird when you think about it. The people who wrote this CSS spec opt to make a certain property inheritable for convenience. It is a developer experience thing, but for developers. It will be super annoying if we have to keep reapplying the same text color style to every child and grandchild as of a container. So most properties that inherits are typography related, like color, font size, text shadow, and so on. You can find more or less complete list of inheriting property on SitePoint. Okay, that's quite interesting here, especially when we talk about inheritance. We build product, we handle bills. You build products, we handle billing. Interesting. Okay, 2017. So SitePoints actually took the effort to do that. Holy fuck. What's SitePoint? A huge library of books and courses on various topics: JavaScript, Python, AI, and more. Oh, okay, Stu. I joined SitePoints to learn more about web stuff, and their PHP MySQL tutorial was probably the first I used. Creator of WordPress, CEO of Automatic. Holy hell. In 2011, 2013. That's interesting. Okay. Wow, we're. Well, holy moly. Okay. Hmm. Mm-hmm. Automatic. Mm-hmm. 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 Holy moly. Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. Holy moly. To learn more about web stuff and the PHP MySQL tutorial was probably the first I used back then. That's mind blowing. That's mind blowing stuff. That's a truly mind blowing stuff. Mm-hmm. Okay. Inheritance. Okay. 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 Exactly.
So I had kind of a fun realization recently, which is that CSS's inheritance looks quite a lot like JavaScript's prototypal inheritance if you squint a little bit. And I'll show you what I mean. So here I have some HTML, and let's just say that I'm wondering what color this word is. Well, one way I could figure that out is I could look to see if its parent element sets any styles, any relevant styles. In this case, the span doesn't. So then I can look at its parent, right, the text node's grandparent. And here I'll see that it sets the style to be color red, which is what I'm looking for. So my journey ends there. But if this didn't do that, right, maybe it said background color instead, then I'd have to look at its grandparent or great-grandparent and see if this main sets a style. And up I would go until I find an appropriate response. And this feels actually quite a lot like how JavaScript works. So here I have the same kind of structure, but in JavaScript land. So I create a span. The span extends the paragraph extends main, and main is the top of our prototype chain. And if I try to access s.color, it's going to check to see if the span class defines a property color. If it doesn't, it's going to check the paragraph class and up until it finds one that does. And similar to HTML, if this was instead of being color background color, it wouldn't stop here. It would have to go one level further until it finds something that returns the color property. So at least in terms of mental model, I really find this is a nice analogy and hopefully helps you think about it.
But that's quite interesting in terms of the inheritance. In terms of the inheritance. Okay? So the answer is that certain CSS property inherit when I apply a color to an element. The value gets passed down to all children and grandchildren. Exactly. So the people who wrote CSS spec opt to make certain properties inheritable for convenience. So the people who wrote CSS opt to or choose to opted to make certain opted to make certain properties inheritable, opted to make certain properties inheritable for convenience. For convenience. Okay, for convenience. It is a developer experience or DX. Alright? So it will be super annoying if we have to keep reapplying the same color text over and over and over and over. So most properties that inherit are typography related. Okay? And this is important to understand at least the basic of that. So most of the properties that inherit are typography related. Most of the typography that inherits are typography related, typography related. Okay, like color, font size, and text shadow. Like color, font size, and text shadow. So font size and text shadow. Text shadow? Interesting. Text shadow. Okay, and so on. You can find more or less complete list, exactly. So you can find a more complete A more complete list of inheriting properties. List of inheritance list of inheritable properties inside here. The key takeaway: CSS inherits simplify the process of styling web site by allowing parent elements to pass on certain properties to child elements, reducing the need for repeated coding. Not all CSS properties are inherited by default. For instance, border or background for this. How is CSS inheritance useful? Only certain properties are inherited. Forcing inheritance. Generally speaking, whether or not to make a property inheritable comes down to common sense. For example, in addition of these examples, we look at this using inheriting keyword to force inheritance, inheriting using CSS shorthand. One solution to this problem is to set the property that we want to inherit arbitrary values that we use inherit with the corresponding longhand shorthand. Missing shorthand values? A list of CSS properties that are inherited. There doesn't seem to be a single definitive source that lists all the CSS properties that inherit, but below it is a list that probably correct based on few sources. There are also a number of speech-related CSS properties. Here are the few sources for inherited property lists, which CSS properties are inherited. In conclusion, so this is a list of CSS properties that are inherited. From side point. It is a prototype. Alright. JavaScript mental model for CSS. JavaScript mental model of inheritance in CSS. But most of the time, most of these are typography-related, like color font size and text shadows. And the other is forcing inheritance. Occasionally, you may wish to have a property inherit even when it wouldn't normally do so. Good example is link colors by default. But anchor tag has built-in style that give unvisited inactive links as blue hue. So we saw earlier there are built-in style for the anchor tag. The trouble is that even through color is an inherited property, it is being overridden by default style. We can fix this by simply telling the anchor tag to inherit their content text color. So this is now forcing inheritance. Forcing inheritance. Inheritance. So occasionally you might wish to have a property inherit here. And this paragraph contains an href hyperlink like so. So as we saw earlier, and as we saw earlier with the built-in type still, we have this. And how can we fix that? Well, by saying stuff like this. So you can say, hey, when you to inherit the color, okay? So when you to inherit the color, mark as complete. The cascade. Alright. Consider the following bit of CSS and HTML. Consider the following bit of CSS and HTML. So you get this. We create two rules, one targeting P and the other targeting a class introduction. Alright? So far, so good. You may already know what happens here. We wind up with a bold, violet paragraph. Exactly. So we apply a bold. We apply here a bold, violet. Okay. A bold violet. Interesting. 0 degrees red. Saturation's gray out is scale. And 10% illumination. Alright. a violet paragraph here. Declaration that p tag and the color declaration from the introduction class. Oh, and the color declaration here, which is overriding here with violet. This example shows the browser cascade algorithm at work. When the browser needs to display our introduction paragraph on the screen, it first needs to figuring out which declarations apply to it. Are we gonna look at the specifications and things like that? Because I think that's quite important, at least to know. Flow layout and that kind of stuff. When the browser needs to display our introduction paragraph on the screen, it first needs to figuring out which declarations applies to the cascade algorithm. And before it can do that, it needs to collect and set a matching rules. One, it has a list of applicable rules. It works out any conflict. Exactly. Once a list of applicable rules, it works out any conflict. I imagine this sort of a death match. If multiple selectors each applies to the same property, it pits the same against each other. Okay, sudden death, but a death match. Two fingers enters, but only one emerge. Okay, two fighters enters, but only one emerge. That's the main idea. The browser will take a set of applicable style rules and whittle it down to a list of specific declarations that are applicable. How does it determine which rule win each battle is dependent on the specificity of the selector. The CSS language includes many different selectors, and each selector has a relative power. For example, classes are more specific than tasks. So if there are a conflict between a class and a task, the class win. ID, however, are more specific than class. So this is okay. Similarity with GSS merging. Here's another fun thought experiment. How might we implement the cascade in JavaScript? It turns out JavaScript has the perfect tool to do the job: spread syntax. In principle, this cascade algorithm works something like this. If you have an inherit style, tag style, blah, 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 blah. In our early example, we saw this CSS snippet like this. This could be written in a JavaScript class like this, where you have the class, tag style, and class. Okay. You have tag style and class style. Alright, and they will be applied something like this. Apply the tag style and class style as it is. The order that they are merged in it is determined by a specificity. Class styles are more specific than tag style, so they are merged in later. This way they override any conflict style, and non-conflict styles are kept. Relevance in modern applications development. CSS specificity gets pretty tricky pretty quickly when you dive below the surface. For example, if both of the following selectors match a button, which one has a higher specificity here? You can calculate it by, in this case, if you say, hey, this is now, okay, if this is now a class, okay, what is the specificity of this? Okay, for a class and an ID, and then you have now a tag, an ID and a class, an ID and a type, and a tag out of a pseudo selectors. You can calculate it by adding up the tag, class, and ID. But honestly, I don't think you need to do this stuff anymore. This is a controversial opinion, but if you work with a component-based frameworks like React, you shouldn't ever have selectors like this. Completely. With the methodology we'll use in this course, styles are tied to components. We won't have gargantuan selectors reaching across an application. All of our style will be collocated in one place, and component will be the mechanism of reuse, not classes. I work in a cat academy, which was the first major non-Facebook applications to use React. The codebase has been worked on by dozens and dozens of engineers since 2013. It is enormous, complicated codebase, by far the most complex codebase I have ever worked on. I mention it because it uses a component-based style solution, and specificity issues never come up. Trust me when I say that if you follow the guidelines in this course, specificity word will not be a problem for you. Because of that, this course will spend much less time of Cascade than most other research. Instead, we'll learn how effectively use model tooling and methodology to solve problems for us. We'll dig much deeper into this topic in Module 3. CSS for JavaScript. If you do wish to go deeper in the cascade, I highly recommend this lovely interactive article by Amelia Waterburn. Holy crap. Combining React and D3. Amelia Waterberger. I write code, think about data, and create digital experience. Currently principal research engineer doing R&D and developer experience on GitHub Office of the CTO team. Listen to podcasts I have been on. I read articles I have written. Intro to D3. When it was okay. Interactive chart with D3DS, full stack D3, and data visualization. Oh, I think that's his book. Illegal foreign fishing. What makes a good country? Correlation with the United States. Oh my god. Interesting. According to what? And when this was put it, you know? Botswana. Botswana is one of the correlation with South Africa. In Japan, Iran, correlation with the United States. Ah, the livelihood. That's interesting. Bolivia. What they mean by correlation with that? Distinctive metric: GDP, health expenditure per person, civil score, health expenditure percentage, and hearing. Where does the data come from? Where does the data come from, bro? You know? Jesus fucking Christ. Oh my god, that hurts. That hurts a lot. Oh my god, that hurts a lot. Oh my god, that hurts a lot. Exactly, but there is a lot of this metrics. Exactly. The correlation is in terms of the population, surface, GDP annual growth, health expenditure, school life expectancy. Holy fuck, for real? Holy shit. Alright, the entire world is like, what? Mm-hmm. There is a reason why a lot of Swedish people, our Iceland people, comes to this, to Uruguay. Mm-hmm. Latvia, Lithuania, and those kind of countries. Government integrity score, financial freedom score, rule of law, GDP annual, and regulatory quality. And the metric that they're using is health expenditure of GDP, school life expectancy years, GDP billions, women and surface, population, surface area, and he was just okay. Dog's name in. Oh, okay. It's because all of these people live in that. The weather circle. Unbiased new aggregators. Okay, that was interesting. So she made that. Mm-hmm. So the CSS case, or how browsers evolve competing CSS style. We style our website using CSS, which stands for Cascading Style here. The CSS cascade is one of the most powerful part of the CSS, the inheritance. Okay, the cascade here, or the cascade algorithm. All right. The cascade algorithm. But it can be also be very frustrating if it's not well understood. Anyone who's worked on a large enough website has complained, why won't this CSS property works? And we have all been tempted to throw an important to strong arm things into place. To save ourselves from future angst, let's take a look at back and learn these things for real. The CSS cascade is the way our browser resolves competing CSS declaration. Every time we write a CSS declaration or rule, it will enter the CSS cascade, which will determine whether or not it will end up as the final style. The further down the cascade a declaration falls, the less likely it will end up as the final style. Let's take a look at the different tiers of the cascade. Okay, the different tiers of the cascade. Importance. The first tier of the cascade looks at the type of a rule we're looking. There are 4 basic type of rules. Transitions. Rules that apply an active transition take the utmost importance. Important, animations, and normal. Okay. This level is where the bulk of rules live. As you can see, this top tier is the most reserved to ensure our elements animated properly and any help of this. Let's take a look at these rules and play out. Oh, who has more that? Rules B wins because of importance. The two rows are tied on one tier of the cascade. The fights go on to another round, looking for a difference on the next tier, the origin. The second tier of the cascade look at at where the rules was defined, and there are three places where a rule can be defined: website, user, and browser. Mm-hmm. So this is okay. The origin, website, users, and browser. Each browser has its own set of style, which is why things like button have default style. This is your browser default style. If you're curious, you can check out the Chromium default set of styles. Funky fact alert: the hierarchy here is actually reserved for importance. Rule meaning that an important browser's default rules wins over an important website. So, the hierarchy here is actually reversed. For important rules, meaning that an important browser default rules over an important website, whereas a website's rule normally wins over a browser default. Okay. So fight time. Which of these rules will win? If this was defined by the browser or the user will win. Exactly. Remember that web-specific declarations or user-specific declaration website style.css. Oh, website style.css. And the other is the specificity. Inline layer ID class attribute pseudo class and type pseudo elements here. Fun fact: universal is all selectors and combinators have no effect on a specificity. More info on MDN. Fight time. Which of these rules will win? Inline style. But again, this is my intuition. Exactly. Inline style declared within a style property are the most specific. Then you have the layer. And when we create a CSS declaration, we can target specific elements using selectors. Exactly. ID, class, and type pseudo element. Fight time. Now, this is for the specificity, inlines and layer. So inline has more, so wins over the CSS or the layer. What about these two paragraph rules? If you now declare, if you use CSS declarations, you can target specific using selectors like the ID, class, and type. So for example, ID, class, exactly, ID, class, attribute, pseudo classes, and then you have now the type and pseudo elements. ID, class, attribute, and pseudo classes. ID first, and then class, attribute, or pseudo classes, and then you have no pseudo elements. Type and pseudo elements. In here, this has more priority here by specificity. One thing to know about levels of this on this star is that the number of hits on the highest reach level matter most. The number of hits on the highest reach levels matters most. So in other words, here, which one of these will win? If you have now a paragraph of the first, The number of hits on the highest reach level matters. So for example, if this is now, and they don't specify about, and type or tag type. Okay, so this is the bucket here, in what is put it. The ID, exactly, the bucket of ID, the bucket of class attributes and pseudo classes, and the bucket of tags and pseudo elements. Interesting. So the number of hits here. Do we have any ID? No. Do we have any class? Yes. Okay, so you will win. Okay, do we have any class or attributes or key? Exactly. Do we have any class or attribute? Exactly. Do we have any class, attribute, class, attribute, and pseudo class? All right. So here has a more priority than this. Why? Because this specificity now hits is the tag, which is way lower, and a class. So this actually wants. Rule 4 has 2 hits, which is it has now a class and a pseudo class. Additionally, on this tier of the cascade, ties can be broken within this tier. This means that if the two rules have the same number of hits on the highest level, one can win by having a hit on the next level down. Okay. One can win by having the next hit on the next level. So in other words, if you have now a class and an ID, alright, so the ID has more priority here, okay, or in this case you have, okay. Additionally, on this side of the cascade, ties can be broken within this tier. This means that if the two rules have the same number of hits on their highest level, one can win by having a hit on the next level. But in this case, you are selecting is by ID. But this is by tag, and this is by ID. This will win, you know, because this has an ID. This is now has an tag, all right, which is way lower, and on the subsequent level, rules A and B both have 1 hit on third level. Okay, on third level, exact. But rule B additionally has 1 hit on the 4th level. But again, rule 8 hits on 5th level 1 tag. Exactly. Rule B on the 5th level, on the first S selector, is now as a tag. When you compare this, it's now an ID. So this actually wins. And lastly, we descend the 4th and final tier of the cascade, which looks at the order of the rule where it is defined. CSS3 Cascade Spec. I highly recommend a browse through the official spec. It is a great and fairly easy to read as a spec goes. Okay, that's interesting. Importing style sheets, the important rule. Okay, this is now reading about this. CSS cascading and inheriting level 4. This CSS abstract model describe how to collate style rules and assign. How to collate? What does it mean collate? Okay. Exactly. Order. Collate. In Spanish? How do you say that in Spanish, bro? Cotejar. Exactly. Collate or cotejar. We're comparing to verify information. But grouping as well. Compaginar. I'm quite familiar with this. Collate, compaginar, cotejar o acotar. En este caso es cotejar porque estás comparando. O agrupar. Interesting. Interesting. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Describing the rendering of a structure such as HTML and XML on a screen, on paper, etc. Status of this document. Model interactions. Importing style sheets, the important rule. Shorthand properties. Value processing. Filtering. Cascading and defaulting. Declare values, cascade values, specific values, computed values. Use values, applicable properties, and examples. And examples here. Okay. Interesting. So that'll be all for this video. Take care. Bye bye.